Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation. My name is Colleen Fitzpatrick, and I'm the current Community Relations and Events Manager in Public Affairs here at CIGI. It's really fabulous to see such a packed house tonight. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for this event, whether you're here as part of our live audience or the many joining us through our live webcast. I'd like to extend a special welcome this evening to attendees of the ILAP conference, which is the International Association of Law Enforcement Planners. The conference is being hosted by the Waterloo Regional Police Service, and as such, there was a reception held here tonight at the CIGI campus, and attendees have joined us for tonight's speaker series. So for our community members who have also joined us, we're feeling just a little bit extra safe tonight. I'd like to extend a special note of thanks to Margaret Glode for all of her hard work in organizing tonight's event. I understand this is the very first time the ILAP conference has ever been held here in Waterloo, so welcome to all attendees, and we hope you enjoy the hospitality here in Waterloo region. And since you are near to Waterloo, welcome to CIGI. CIGI is a nonpartisan think tank focused on international governance issues to advance policy debate and generate ideas, basically to make our planet a better place to live. We were founded by Jim Balsillie, who many of you would know, was the former co-CEO of BlackBerry. Our programs focus on such issues as global security, global economy and politics, and international law. So tonight we have a double feature for you. By special request this evening, after our lecture and a short break, we're rescreening a film we showed last Wednesday on the dark web and the Silk Road entitled The Deep Web. This is a 90-minute documentary we're showing as a free community event. Popcorn and refreshments will be available for sale just outside these doors from the Y Cafe in the foyer. So please stay and join us for the film, which illuminates the legal implications of the deep web on a global scale. But back to our speaker for this evening. Following this evening's address, we welcome questions from both our audience here at the microphones, in the auditorium, or through the live web chat function on your webcast screen if you're watching from afar. Please remember to state your name and to keep questions brief. Here to introduce tonight's speaker is Inspector Tom Bursey of the Waterloo Regional Police Service.
Thank you very much, Colleen, and welcome to all of you in the audience tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Bessma Momani. Dr. Momani is a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation and the Institute for Canadian Citizenship and professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and the Balsillie School of International Affairs. She's a 2015 fellow of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation and a Fulbright scholar. Dr. Momani is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Doha Center and has been non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and a visiting scholar at Georgetown University's Mortara Center. She has authored and co-edited over 8 books and over 65 scholarly, peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters that have examined the IMF, the World Bank, petrodollars, the Middle East, and Arab youth. She's a current recipient of a research grant funded by Canada's Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council to study IMF and World Bank cooperation. Dr. Momani is also a past recipient of 2 previous SSHRC grants on the reform of the IMF Executive Board and on Middle East urbanization. She's a regular contributor to national and international media on the Arab region, international politics, and on the global governance issues, and has written editorials for the New York Times, The Economist, The Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, Newsweek, the Ottawa Citizen, and many other reputable international newspapers. It's my pleasure to present to you Dr. Bessma Momani.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm going to hopefully give you a little bit about where ISIS has come from, talk to you a little bit about some of the latest research, some of which we've done here at both the University of Waterloo, at CIGI, and many other international think tanks and universities. The message that I have today is really about how to not just understand ISIS and understand those who are lured by ISIS, but to also understand how we can combat it. And with many of our law professionals or law enforcement professionals here in the room, this is really hopefully going to garner a lot of questions and discussion. I understand as well that many of you have participated or been active in the planning of countering violent extremism strategy. So I'm really looking for our Q&A, and hopefully that'll be an interactive method. So if we could to the next slide. Am I controlling that? I guess I am. That's great. Good to know. Okay, so the rise of ISIS. You know, one of the things that I want us to just take a look at here is that if we take a look at the map of where ISIS has thrived, I do want you to note that for much of it, we are talking about major cities and a lot of deserted areas. And one of the things that has been a myth about ISIS is that it really controls a territory, as we've often heard, almost the size of Texas, right? I mean, this is sort of the common phrase. But keep this in mind, because what you see here are a lot of highways and deserts. In fact, if I were to put an overlap on there, you would note that a big part of that area there that ISIS holds are actually uninhabited. That's not to say that they don't hold major cities. And today, the one city that many of us are watching is in Iraq, Mosul, which at the point in its heyday had 2 to 3 million citizens. So it is not small by any measure, but let's keep that in mind as we talk more about this. So in thinking about ISIS, one of the things that I think I want us to really get at here is that ISIS was born out of the anarchy, born out of what we call a political vacuum in Syria and Iraq. By that I mean there was no functioning government in the part of Syria, the eastern part of the country of Syria and the western part of Iraq. In the eastern part of Syria, as we all know, we watched the rise of a very cruel regime run by Bashar al-Assad, who to this date has the blood on his hands of nearly 1 million or 500,000 people. It's one of the reasons why we have an exodus of 9 million people that are half of which internally displaced and the other half of which have left primarily to Europe, but outside the country in places like Jordan, Lebanon, and elsewhere. So there is a vacuum there in terms of there is no government, there is no central government keeping, if you will, control. In Iraq, we have a similar situation, but a little different. And this is born from a series of destructive policies of the predecessor prime minister named Nouri al-Maliki, who really basically made many of the citizens in this part of Iraq feel like they were a fifth column, feel like they weren't really a part of the Iraqi state. And that became ripe territory for these terrorists to move in and create an alternative to what was deemed to be repressive Baghdad rule. Okay? So in that context, we have to keep this in mind, that this is basically a terrorist organization that filled a vacuum on the ground where there was no central government. We know that, of course, in Syria as well, this raging war has meant that there is on the ground also a great sense of uncertainty, a great sense of not knowing what the next action will be by both the government and many of the rebel forces. And so we had a situation where Al-Qaeda, which is really the genesis of ISIS, you know, Al-Qaeda basically had a franchise strategy at one point. One of the things that Al-Qaeda at one point in its great strength had actually tried to go out there and create its franchisees, and basically in a very decentralized rule said, you know, if you want to pick up the brand, go ahead, call yourself Al-Qaeda of Yemen, call yourself, it was actually the Arabian Gulf, call yourself Al-Qaeda of X and Y, and we'd be happy to have you with our basically our overall umbrella strategy. And so ISI, the Islamic State of Iraq, was the predecessor to ISIS. And in fact, that was an Al-Qaeda offshoot. But we actually saw between Al-Qaeda Central in Afghanistan and the soon-to-be leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, a real change in philosophy and thinking. In fact, they started to have their own fights about what is really the right thing to do in terms of governing territory. And where Al-Qaeda, for all its brutality in terms of how to seize territory or for all its brutality in hitting Western targets, the one thing that much of the Al-Qaeda philosophy had always been very careful about was to do no harm to those locals that you have in your vicinity. In other words, have this awful strategy abroad, target innocent civilians abroad, but in your, in that awful proverb of, don't in your own backyard, you don't do that in your own backyard. You have to keep the citizens that you are, in bed with, make sure that they remain happy. In the case of Baghdadi and ISIS, it was a very different strategy. In fact, one of the most important manuals for ISIS till this day is The Art of Savagery, the very book about how to rule and govern your population. And if you read it, it's almost as cruel as one can get. There isn't a single reference in religion in that manual. It's all about put fear and terror in your citizens from the first day. In fact, one of my children are reading Animal Farm, and it really resonates with me because this is exactly what ISIS builds. It creates new rules. It creates rules that have no basis in religion, have no basis in logic, but creates an environment of fear and terror. And as long as you have that situation, and the book is very clear, you can govern a territory of 1 million, 2 million people with as little as 4,000 armed men, which is what we have today in Mosul. We have up to 4,000 to 5,000 fighters in Mosul, but they issue text messages to the people. They send pictures of the latest beheaded person who chewed gum on the wrong side of the street, or the chew gum and spit it out on the street, and that creates this climate of fear. That's how it maintains control, okay? Now that we know how it maintains control, let me tell you a little bit about ISIS itself. One of the things that's quite interesting about ISIS and what it practices in its territory, and by that I mean the governing style that it has, is very different than what it is doing online. Now, the key thing here is that ISIS, and if I could just, let you think about a cult, okay? Think about the cult, because, the cult has some of the same messaging that we see ISIS uses. And this is really quite different and new in terms of the terrorist landscape. So ISIS starts off by trying to lure, that's the only word I can give to you, is to lure people into its nest. It starts off by a message that we are creating something new. We are creating a state, right? And as long as we hyped it up and talked about a state as big as Texas, we were also doing a disservice, okay? So we talked about this, so the lure is, talking about this idea of it being a state. The second item here is that it's a utopia. This is really key. This starts to sound like a cult, right? Because you create this land that is a utopia, and you lure people to come to this land where it's corrupt-free. It's a land that doesn't have crime. It doesn't have crime because very clear black and white principles of what is right and what is wrong, okay? That obviously is not very, great for those who see a lot of gray in the world, like many of us. There is this black and white moral clarity. And this is really important for ISIS messaging. It's important because it lures primarily young people. It lures primarily people searching for an identity, who feel that their world around them is corrupted, who feel that the world around them has done them wrong. And going to this place, this mythical utopia called ISIS territory, is a form of rebirth, is a form of purification of oneself. This is really key. This is really key because it also means, for those law enforcement people in the room, it also means that it's those who are most vulnerable in our society that are also the ones most lured, okay? It is people looking for an identity. It's people looking for a community where they don't have one. And it's also a way of, in many cases we see, that many of these individuals who are lured to ISIS have a very long rap sheet. They do. They tend to be petty criminals. They tend to have, many of them have served time in prison, more so in Europe, and particularly in France, which I'll come back to as a key problem. But this is really important because it creates this myth that coming to ISIS territory will wipe the record clean for you, okay? The other thing, too, is that much of ISIS territory has been seen as a war zone. And there are some psychologists who also find another common luring mechanism is people who are seeking adventure. You know? So in addition to those who are coming to be cured, it also appeals to young men who are looking for adventure, young men primarily, sorry for being very generalistic, but the numbers are clear, looking for a way to be a hero. That they're not a hero in their community, they're not a hero in their society, but going somewhere to a land where they can be a hero. It doesn't help that there are very graphic images, and this is the key thing here, not graphic images of what ISIS does. There are graphic images of the war in Syria. And so many people will go to this thinking that they are going to help and be, in fact, a way to help the Syrian people fight the Assad regime. Ironically, when we've looked at much of the battles between ISIS and the Assad regime, they tended not to really fight each other. So this is a myth, but the luring on the attraction of many people to go to ISIS territory is premised on this idea that they will go there and they will fight against the corrupt system of Assad, and they will also become reborn, repure, etc. Okay? One of the things, if we could just go to the map, or to the slide, which I don't control. Thank you. So one of the things I want to bring your attention to is where are the fighters coming from? Okay? If we look at where the fighters are coming from, we notice a couple of patterns. And in fact, one of the key, most common denominator, and this is a study by my colleagues at the Brookings Institution in Washington, showed that the chances of being in a country that is francophone is one of your highest predictabilities of who will go to ISIS territory. And so much of this argument is based on the reality that Belgium, France have some of the highest rates. It is not a coincidence that in these societies there are many young people who are relegated to the periphery of Paris, who are meant to feel that they are not really French citizens, despite having a citizenship, being born there. They're often second, third generation French citizens, but they are never in the eyes of the French to be truly French. So we know that there's also a factor of alienation, a factor of state, some would even call it state repression, and we'll talk about the case of Russia. Because the other dark, if you look back up there, one of the darkest places as well tends to be that of Russia. And Russia in particular, if we look at it, it's primarily Chechnyans who are going. Now Chechnya, if you know a little bit about the history of Chechnya, has been under unbelievable constant bombardment by the Russian regime. And only till recently, many of those Russian fighters that we see coming to Syria had been hardened fighters in their own country, fighting for self-determination against the Russians. So we seem to see there are also some foreign policy or some domestic political situations that also can be a push factor, okay? This is important because we know that there are pull factors and we know there are push factors. We do not have a complete, perfect profile of who will be an ISIS fighter. We just know that there are things that are common, and these are the common patterns that we have. The other thing that I would say is social media. We know that unlike previous terrorist organizations that did recruitment face-to-face, the current age of recruitment is happening online. And that is making it very difficult. It's making it very difficult for law enforcement, of course, making it difficult for government, and making it difficult for families and communities, which I want to talk about. Social media is quite interesting here because, you know, much of us have seen some of the most gruesome YouTube-type videos. And we all know that you can find some horrendous videos. But one of the things that is quite interesting, done by some analysts in the United States who really went through the trouble of going through every single video. And in fact, there's far more. There are 80% of the videos related to ISIS are deemed to be positive. What do I mean by that? Positive messaging. Well, we see the 20% because that's what horrifies us. The vast majority for searching that material find 80% of which are positive. What do they show? they show fruit markets, they show people, usually first-person testimony about how wonderful it is in ISIS territory, how the streets are clean, unlike in the capital of Baghdad or in Damascus, how that they have great jobs, that they're very happy. It is propaganda. And ISIS has basically figured out how to be the best propaganda machine online. It uses this intensely. And we are significantly outnumbered. And I dare say we have not put nearly as much investment in this from a policy perspective as we should. And I just want you guys to think about how much it costs to drop one bomb versus to put social media strategists who are doing the kind of counter messaging that needs to be done online. Keep that thought in that back there. We know also that when we look at, for example, some of the media companies. Now, you all know I had a picture of Snowden. It's supposed to be a very good movie coming out. Snowden. One of the things that made the fight against ISIS online more difficult was that Snowden revealed that the government had access to our files, access to our information. What did that do? Well, that made Silicon Valley really frustrated and basically increasing their own encryption. So it made it more difficult now for law enforcement to be able to get access to those files. And we've seen this, I think, many times. Of course, the San Bernardino case of Apple, the FBI asking Apple to basically release that information was denied, and then obviously FBI eventually said that they did it. They could do it on their own. But that was just one case of thinking about all of the many, many cases that are out there that makes the point here that it was a fight now between the freedom of information that we all, I think, want and can agree that we want to keep, right? And I'm really happy that you're going to see a film about the dark web later, because this is a tension. This is a theoretical tension that we have not solved in our free society. Do we want the government to snoop on us? Do we want full freedom? Is there a happy medium? What does that look like? These are the kinds of questions we need to ask as a society, and I don't think we've come to a consensus because we still don't really understand how much really monitoring there is of us, and how much are we giving powers to law enforcement agencies, intelligence agencies to watch us. This is a big debate, right? The other thing that I would want to point out here is that even in the case of Twitter, for example, at one point deleted 120,000 Twitter accounts of ISIS and ISIS sympathizers. This was after a lot of fight between the State Department and much of the American administration with Twitter. The next day, 20,000 reappeared. It's a whack-a-mole strategy. It's not easy. And in fact, now we're seeing terrorists now migrating to a different platform. Where Twitter was their favorite platform, they're now moving to Telegram, which is far more encrypted than Twitter, a German company. So it's really, again, it's a real race, and we're not really up to speed on the technical capabilities, but they are. And again, watch the film about the dark web, because you'll get a sense of where they go to have these conversations. The other thing, too, that I want you guys to keep in mind, and this is back to the point of the luring. It was revealed in the New York Times with a great deal of fantastic investigative reporters that showed that ISIS devotes 15 people for every one individual they want to lure. These are social media strategists who befriend, and I use that word very carefully because it is a friendship that they build with these young people. They choose people that tend to be, again, dislocated for their community. One great one that I really encourage you to look at was how, Middle America, Bible Belt America, this young woman was lured by ISIS recruits who had no fun in her life, very bored existence, and basically ISIS befriended her, sent her packages for her birthday, constantly asking her, what's your day like? How are things going? Tell me more about, your day today. And this becomes a really important part of, as well, luring young people to come to ISIS territory. That's really important. They lure through kindness. Key word, they lure through kindness. They lure through positive messaging of that propaganda. Now, one of the good things is that we know that when young people go to ISIS territory, they realize that's just a full of you-know-what. That's not how ISIS actually governs and rules. they realize quite quickly when they get there that it's horrible, that there are rules for some people that don't follow for others, that there is a lot of hypocrisy. There are those who are the preferred ISIS operatives and those who are basically the front of the line suicide bombers, and it tends to be organized along ethnic lines. Save the white people for the camera. All of the brown ones go behind strapped on with the belt. And you get to see that there is a perverse animal farm type of rule in ISIS. This is really key because this is our greatest strength, ironically, in fighting ISIS. Now, I turn to what is a greater challenge now for us today. So we are in 2016, after 2 years of a great deal of effort by the international community, with a 7-point plan to fight ISIS that includes everything from stopping the export of oil, from making sure that their financial coffers are repleted, to bombing ISIS communication towers, to fighting as much as we can from the skies. Keep that in mind because we're not willing to put foreign troops on the ground, right? So this is all about how much can you do from the skies. We have now a situation where ISIS territory has shrunk. It hasn't shrunk everywhere, and a key thing here is looking at Mosul. That city up there is really key because it is one of the largest cities. It's 2 million people. But cities like Deir ez-Zor, Raqqa, which continues to be their professed capital, all of that are still very much under ISIS rule. But now ISIS has a new message too, where it spent much of the first 2 years trying to lure people to come in. It now has a new message. Why does it have a new message? Well, it has a new message because there's less and less of a territory for people to come to. Also, as you can see if you find more and more of the videos, there's less and less really nice fruit markets and people, new videos of people saying, oh, come here, it's great, because many of those who do make their way don't find it very great, and there's less of those videos. And so they're not able to lure people to come to ISIS territory anymore. Now that ISIS is in decline, ISIS has a new strategy, a new message. It's don't come here, stay where you are. And if you want to show your allegiance to ISIS, carry out a terrorist attack over there, where you are. And that has led to the situation where we have far more bombings outside now of ISIS territory than we did before. And this is becoming the new normal that we have to deal with. How do you fight against the new normal of ISIS-inspired operatives or ISIS-inspired terrorists who want to commit atrocities abroad? Key thing here is that they are ISIS-inspired. The new normal, the new problem for law enforcement professionals is how do we stop the ISIS-inspired? They're not going to be ISIS operatives. The chance of them actually going to ISIS territory and coming back have now diminished, although we have that problem, okay? Earlier I talked about those who went, but we also have had, in our own case here in Canada, we've had 180 ISIS supporters, ISIS inspired, and we've had 60 foreign fighters that actually have tried to come back. So we do have this foreign fighter returnee problem as well. This is the challenge for much of the Western law enforcement. As you can see, the attacks now that are happening by lone wolves. Some of it may be they would have been criminals who would have done the same acts of terror had there not been an ISIS, but now they have a hook to hook onto. Now they have an ISIS ideology to say that they are a part of. Remember that search for community? Remember that search for identity? They're also using that and being famous and wanting to be that ISIS terrorist that's face is going to be all over the news. You know, I'm a person that grew up with the horrors of school bombings, school shootings, and thinking about Columbine. One of the things that we learned from that atrocity was to not give those murderers the platform where they become heroes and viewed to be some sort of heroic individual. And this is what many of these ISIS-inspired lone wolves now seek in these atrocities. The other challenge here is that, of course, we're now dealing with soft targets, right? We're now dealing with soft targets. And the reality is soft targets cannot be patrolled. There's not enough of you in the room. to patrol every soft target in our city. It's just not humanly possible. We don't have the capability. And this is really key, because I think as we start talking about what can we do to prevent, what can we do to counter this, we need to start thinking about the reality that there is no law enforcement solution to this. Because it's not humanly possible for all of you to be everywhere at all times. So, on that note, countering violent extremism or preventing violent extremism. Now, a year ago, the buzzword was CVE, countering violent extremism. It's still being used by many government agencies, but increasingly we're moving to the philosophy of even preventing violent extremism. That's your best bet for intervention, is to get there early and to be able to prevent this. How do you do that? You do that by making a communities your partner. You do that by creating resilient communities who are your partner. And I'm using that word very carefully, because one of the things that we know from failed counter-violent extremism program, and I'm going to point out to the one called Prevent, ironically, it's called Prevent, in the UK. That's not going well. That's actually not a countering violent extremism program. That is cloaked as a surveillance program. There are far more people that are being charged with crimes in the UK now than are actually processed and actually found to be guilty. And that's an indication that there's a mismatch there. And today, the community in the UK no longer see themselves as a partner, but of a victim of law enforcement. We need to make sure that we don't get to that. And how do you become a partner? By recognizing the math. Recognizing the math is really important here. Because in the 1.6 billion people who profess to be Muslim, you have ISIS is technically accounts for, and I'm not even counting those who were not born Muslim, I'll talk about that in a second, 0.0006.25% of the population. Do you know what that amounts to? That amounts to one city block in a metropolitan area. So think about this in terms of that does not represent 1.6 billion people. When one truly, truly believes that, then you become a partner of communities that start to also, increasingly, we know, are frustrated with having their name of their religion sullied and brought through the mud, so to speak. They know that they want to be law-abiding citizens, and they know that they are very good and better than all of you at predicting those outliers, okay? So partnering with communities is really key here. And that's the key principle of CVE or PVE, is to work with communities to help. Work with communities, again, as a partner. If there's a hierarchy in that relationship, it doesn't work. And so this is something that I think is worthy of great debate. You guys have 2-3 days to talk about all of the things that you guys do. Thinking about that balance is really key, right? As a parent, I always say, my daughter, I'm the boss of my kids, but I don't want her to know that. That method which works great in parenting, I've read all the books, really stinks when you get to the community level. They know when you're not really working with them and you feel like you're the boss. Working and partnering with communities is your best bet for CVE and PVE. Okay. The other thing, too, is if you don't believe me on that philosophical level, if I can get the lovely slide back up there, the other thing that you need to know is that it takes 12 to 20 of you, not just for soft targets, 12 to 20 professionals in order to surveil a person 24 hours a day, right? You don't have the capacity, not any of the great agencies, whether we're talking about CSIS or all of you, to have the capacity to monitor one individual at a time. We don't have the capacity. In fact, doing the math, if we have 200 people that are known on our list to be sympathizers, we need help. You need help, not me. You need help, right? You need help, and the community can be your source of help. How do we create not only a countering violent extremism, but how do we go one step earlier? How do we go to the preventing violent extremism? That's where we start to get into sophisticated conversations. This is where we need to talk about things like counter-heroes. Because remember, one of the things I said about luring ISIS is that they want to be a hero. But they don't have heroes in their country, in their society, in their communities to basically emulate. Supporting counter-heroes is really key, okay? In fact, many people would say that in France, where many of the young Muslim community don't see one of their own achieving the types of success that they should, is a huge barrier to seeing the prevention of violence. Now, we can rest on some laurels here. In fact, one of the things that I think has made us, both Canada and even the United States, a little more successful in not having the foreign fighter problem is that we have historically done better at making sure that immigrants who come to this country and their next generation and the next generation have not just the rights and responsibilities of every citizen, but feel Canadian. This is something we can really be proud of. Really interesting. Environics Institute, which is a survey company, did a poll just last summer and found that Canadian Muslims, 94% of which felt more Canadian than anything else. They had a higher sense of belonging than non-Muslims in Canada. Yeah. So this is a resource. This is a partnership. This is an asset for us here in Canada that we need to think about in our community and in our engaging with community partners. Counter-messaging. Again, this is about showing them the truth about ISIS. And many of the Muslim Canadian community know the truth about ISIS. They know that much of what ISIS says to people in their so-called territory is not actually Islam, is not actually found in Scripture, is not actually based in true reality of most Muslim societies. That is an important and powerful counter-messaging. And they can also debate Scripture, because at the end of the day, many of these young people basically gravitate to one or two pieces of Scripture, and I think many of us can go to our own sources of faith books and find things that don't necessarily translate well in 2016. They will gravitate to those verses and basically argue in favor of some of the acts that they have today. Having professionals in the community who can debate Scripture with these young people is important. That preventative strategy is also a de-radicalization strategy. And the last bit of information that we need to think about is, what do we do about reintegration? So we've already had 60 people try to come back, okay? We've had young people in Europe, honestly, a very sad story that I had a chance to read. In France, for example, where a young man very much went through a great deal of ordeal and turmoil in his life, was lured into ISIS, got there 2 days later, calls his father and says, I don't know what happened to me. The father literally thought he was lost somewhere in France. How do I come back? That father had no good answer, because coming back to France was imprisonment. And ironically, radicalization rates in French jails is higher than anywhere else in the world. And so what do we do? What do we do about integration? What do we do about this middle of America, again, this young woman who gets lured by these ISIS people, makes their way there, and then wants to come home? That's a conversation we need to have. Do we have reintegration? Now, in some countries, it's illegal, right? And when that becomes the issue, it's really difficult to talk about reintegration. Countries like Denmark have actually made a lot of progress, because not only do they reintegrate them, do you know what they do? They put them on a speaking tour. Yeah. They say, this is the counter-messaging that we need. Great, go to the community centers and talk to all the vulnerable youth. And they can tell those young people, it's Animal Farm, these are the rules, this is the craziness that I saw, there's nothing about being a hero, you're not saving the Syrian people, in fact, you're killing far more Muslims than you're saving, which is a reality. All of that is part of a preventative strategy that works. But it's thinking outside the box. It's thinking about if you were a parent who had an 18-year-old who was vulnerable, as many parents who remember their 18-year-old, they were vulnerable. What do we do? And that's a community conversation that needs to happen. And law enforcement, when going to many of those homes and those communities has to have that kind of sympathy, because I think that's where the conversation starts. It's not an easy one. It's definitely not black and white. There's a lot of gray. But I think this is where one of the good things I have to, again, toot our horn here as Canadians. I think we're prepared for that. We understand there's a lot of gray in life, and it's worthwhile to talk about that in order to get a better society. So thank you. I'm open to your questions. I would love to hear more from the audience who, again, have had firsthand experience in this, and answer any questions that you might have. So I believe we tend to have mics at the bottom here, and if there is an online question, I get it over here. You're first up. Oh, you're a moderator. Okay. Is this the shyness 5 minutes, or really no questions? Hi.
My name is Anna Hometsky, and it's very strange. Last Wednesday, Thursday, I had family over, and we were talking about these things at the table. And
Well, you have some interesting family conversations.
I know, yeah. And it's amazing, well-meaning people, Canadians, know nothing about all of these things you've talked about. In fact, I'm shocked too in learning some things tonight. So how can we get these messages out to people who want to help, who go, what do we do? Who are living in a vacuum, sort of in ignorance, really. Probably, when you're ignorant, you blame the whole group for things they don't do. See, we're not educated, that's the problem. So how do we educate us to help these young people and to help prevent all this terrorism?
Yeah. Well, great question. I must say that I spend more time thinking this at a policy level, but you're asking me as a citizen, which I'm so happy, as a concerned citizen, what to do. I think this, and I want to say this because there's no sugarcoating ISIS brutality, and those who are guilty of crimes need to pay for those crimes. This is a no measure, and I really hope that's clear, that there's no measure here. Terrorism is not ever a justifiable method for anything. But the key thing here is that we also need to understand that there are push and pull factors, that there is no racial profile, that there is no religious profile. And important for us to really keep an open mind, I think, for understanding that there are many members of, and I can be very frank here, the Muslim Canadian community that feel like as though the gaze is upon them. That collective gaze, that collective gaze where they have to adjust for the crimes of people who are in this faraway land and what to do about it. So I think one way is many of the local, mosques are open. They have open houses. Go there, learn about a faith, be empowered by understanding how very much this doesn't fit in that ISIS fold or that ISIS explanation of what Islam is. I think that's really, really important, because one of the things that is being used in recruitment material is also to many young Muslim men in particular, that Western societies will never accept you, that you are never going to be a really truly viewed as a member of your country. Now again, we're very lucky here that in Canada, we know from survey evidence that that's not the case. But think about France. And I think that many of us who go to France know that there is a class system there. And it's not a coincidence that it's along ethnic religious lines. That's really important for us to know. And again, as law professionals, we have, I think, a great advantage not to be in that big structural, systematic pressure cooker, which as an individual, you don't have a lot of say in, right? I mean, back to this idea that it's a big system. But building those one-on-one relationships really matter. I think there's a lot that we can do. I think Mennonite Church, for example, is a great example of where they really take this philosophy of building communities and trust on a one-on-one basis. And that's where I would get some of my teachings on where you would get that, wonderful personal interaction with members of the Muslim Canadian community, here in Waterloo included, that I think can help build the resilient communities that we need. I didn't give you an action item for tonight, but hopefully got you thinking about some things.
Hello, my name is Victor Hebert. My question is about the Muslim community around us. One doesn't hear very much answers from the Muslim church and the Muslim community about their involvement or their not involvement or not being part of it. Should the Muslim church say more and be out there more in the news media and so on, talking against this and separating themselves from it? Or why are they so quiet?
So a couple of things on that. They're not very quiet. In fact, there are many, many national declarations, international declarations, list of Canadian imams, for example, who've written letters, who have written enormous amount of material, signed letters, some of which are published on Canadian news sites. So there's a lot of opposition. I think one of the other things that I think we need to think about is also, did the Christian community apologize for David Koresh? Right? I mean, where does the responsibility of a community come in to apologize on behalf of one individual? This is something else that I think is quite sensitive for the Muslim community. Does it have a role in apologizing for every act of terror, not done in really its name, but actually abusing its name? So it's a really sensitive issue, but I don't think that we can say that in fact mosques have been passive about this. In fact, they have welcomed political leaders. We see that in fact in a number of cases, and many might know about, for example, what we saw in Toronto recently and in London, a lot of them were stopped because individuals went to these mosques, and the people who run these mosques recognize that these people have views that are really outside the norm, that they have views that don't resonate with the rest of the community, and something's not right. And so there's a lot of activity, and I think many of the law enforcement professionals would attest to this. There's a lot of activity of ISIS sympathizers that are thwarted that we don't hear about, far more. And that's happening not usually because of our great CSIS technology. It's happening because we have Muslim mosques that are basically making sure that these individuals not just get reported, but there's an interventionist strategy to stop the further radicalization of these young people. That's an effective strategy. But I think we need to also keep this in mind, that is there a collective responsibility? Is there a collective responsibility for people every time a person of their faith creates or commits an act of terror? I don't know if we have an easy answer to that. And many Muslims will say to you, it's not their fault. It's not their responsibility. They didn't raise the person. They had nothing to do with the person, just like many people in this room would not have to feel that they have to attest or apologize for the acts committed by a person who shares their religious faith.
Hi.
Hi.
My name's John Wolf, and I think that whole naming of the ISIS was wrong when it first started. Now, the newspapers and all the publishing people decided to call them ISIS, but they're neither Islamic nor are they a state. So we've been thinking about them the wrong way. Mm-hmm. They're not nothing. I'm not Muslim, and it has nothing to do with Muslims. These people, they're cowards, just got money and some guns. Mm-hmm. And I think we got to stop calling them ISIS. That's an acronym, right?
Yes, it is.
And what is it exactly? State, Islamic State.
Iraq and Syria.
Yeah, Iraq and Syria terrorists. Mm-hmm. They're not Islam. They're not a state, really.
Yeah, I completely agree with you.
So we got to stop calling them Muslims, because they're not. They're Canadians and Americans and anybody who wants to go join them now.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we gotta stop calling them Muslims.
Yeah, and there is a tendency, of course, in some international agencies to call them Daesh, which is also an acronym in the Arabic acronym for similarly, but also has a negative connotation when translated from Arabic. I think that there is an interesting movement to, for example, the Toronto Star no longer uses the word ISIS. We have, for example, BBC will say the so-called Islamic State. There are different policies depending on where you go, right? And which makes things a lot more confusing, and you get this alphabet soup of acronyms. The United States government uses ISIL because they refused to say Syria at the end because they wanted very clear from the beginning to divorce this from their Syria policy, and so they used L for Levant. So there are very different rationales, and different agencies have different wording. I think that while there are many who would argue that if we removed that label, it might actually make things better, particularly on the CVE and PVE side. That may be the case, but I don't think it really makes a difference in the fight against ISIS, to be quite honest with you. I think that the name has stuck. It's really difficult for either academics or the journalists to really change midstream. But your point is warranted, one that has really garnered a lot of debate about what should we call it. And I think there are many who agree that because it's not Islamic and not a state, it really shouldn't be called that. So thank you for your comment.
Hi, my name is Mike. I'm a
You're my student, so I know who you are.
Yeah, I know. I just keep,
The gig is up, Mike. We all know who you are. And you're not a plant, right? I didn't give you this question in advance, did I?
No, but
okay, good.
It's all right, good. How can Canada, as a secular state, deal with the form of Wahhabism, where it's openly takfiri? And how can Canada with the conflicting values of secularism and also talk about Wahhabism?
Yeah. So I think we need to start with the premise that we're not a secular state. Let's be honest with ourselves, right? We're not a secular state. We are influenced by Judeo-Christian laws. We still are. There are many things. I think you only need to go some very interesting ceremonies on Queen's Park to see a lot of Judeo-Christian references. And I think that's a reality. But one of the things that we can think about is that we do believe in having diversity in this country, and that's really important. Our basic premise of believing that you come to this country and don't have to give up who you are, your identity, your culture, your faith, and that makes us all not just more interesting, right, but it makes us stronger, is really an important CVE strategy. And that's why we're doing pretty well here. It's not to rest on our laurels. It's not to say that we've figured it all out. But that's a really important policy decision that makes it a lot better for many Canadian Muslims here. And that's not the case in France. That's the reality. I mean, that's secularism to the extreme, right? Where they do have secularism and it becomes a form of religious discrimination, right? And again, philosophically speaking, when you're not allowed to practice your faith. Now, of course, I'm not going to, we can open up that black box of French laïcité till the cows come home, right? It is a form of, in many people's eyes, it's a form of religious discrimination when they can't practice their faith. So that's not, thankfully, I think, the situation here in Canada, but I wouldn't call us a secular society. I think that's really important. That didn't answer your question, Mike. I didn't actually answer your question, did I? But you can come to my office hours and we can have this debate later.
I'm sorry to hog the microphone,
Oh, no, not at all.
but this has just been on my mind. But you said some profound things in terms of prevention, but you never mentioned the deeper problem of weapons and ammunition. Actually, a lot of people are making a lot of money promoting these wars and this violence and propaganda. Sure. And if you want to stop something, you stop sending them ammunition and making a pile of money. And we haven't even touched on that. It's very political, it's very deep, it's out of my power. But as a government and governments who are interested in protecting their people, even the terrorists, okay, we feel sorry for them too, because there is a lot of ammunition sold And that's got to stop.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that comment. Absolutely.
Hi there.
Hi.
I just thought it was an excellent point bringing up social media. And about a year or two ago, I noticed somebody on YouTube called Anas Marwa who had a channel that was parodying people who go off and join ISIS. You've probably heard of them. But I was wondering how you thought that should be approached. Like, how should social media be tackled? Should it be organic in that way, or should the government be spending money and
That's a
investing?
great question. Great question, yeah. So one of the things that we're noticing, for example, and some of this is, great youth-generated content online, some of which doesn't necessarily come with government money, but really, everything from a comedy channel making fun of ISIS, which really works. It's great. Bringing in a little bit of comic relief is useful, especially if you want to target that audience. But there is a lot of money out there. The reality is there is a lot of money out there. I would profess that actually it's not enough. And it's peanuts compared to how much we're putting in terms of selling guns and weaponry. If you think about the defense contracts and the billions of dollars, some of these programs and some of the best programs, for example, are in the United States. The US, for example, spends, $100, $200 million? Compare that to billions and billions and billions. So there's a huge mismatch of how much is actually invested in this. And if we put a lot more in the prevention, I think we could do something about this. And this is, again, a philosophy that it's not an easy fix. It's not an easy fix. And for voters, sometimes it's unpalatable. This idea that you're giving money to young people to debate scripture, or giving young people an opportunity to have a comedy fest, making fun of ISIS. These are the kinds of things that, frankly, hit the newspaper and people start talking about, this waste of money. And I say, actually, those are the preventative strategies that we have we can't tell whether or not they worked, because prevention is prevention. You don't actually be able to see whether or not you've been able to stop people. But they are worthwhile investments, and we need more of that. We need more money, more research, more funding into these preventative strategies, which do pay off. And we're just starting. In fact, some of my colleagues and I are actually starting to research what of the CVE strategies works best. And we know that the more organic they are, as the word was said, the more bottom up, the more that it's created by youth for youth, the best form of CVE. Some of us are not necessarily in tune with what the young kids have. We don't want to necessarily be creating YouTube videos from my office or yours. We want the young people to get the money and to generate that content online. That's the most effective way. But I have to point out that as, again, a political scientist, we know that that's not necessarily always easy sell to our voters. And in some societies, it's a lot easier to sell the idea that we're going to bomb the smithereens of ISIS, right? It's sexy, looks like we've got a lot of, testosterone. It's great. It's machismo. It's fantastic. Why wouldn't you want to celebrate that? But it's a costly. I really want to focus on, forget the morality of that, focus on the dollars and cents. The dollars and cents, it is far more costly to wage war than it is on the preventative strategy. And I'm not a pacifist. I think there's a nice, healthy balance that needs to be put in that. But the point is, we are very lopsided in our approach here. We put far more in the military strategy than we do in the preventative.
Hi, my name's Kira. I'm with Mike as well. You mentioned the prevent strategy from the UK.
Yes.
And there were some of us university students who were skeptical about it from the onset and the way it was packaged.
Yep.
And it was packaged to some people as a bottom-up approach.
Yep.
How can the lovely members of the audience here who are the enforcement strategists not divert into that patronizing kind of rhetoric that we sometimes find in prevent, or all the time find in prevent?
Yeah. Okay, where to begin with the UK? It's not an effective strategy. And it doesn't help that one of the so-called biggest proponents of it, symbolism is important. Really, I want to keep this in mind here. Tony Blair, and you know this well probably, is one of these people who is a great benefactor of this program and who leads a lot of these programs and has been the so-called champion of these programs. But Tony Blair, in the eyes of many of the Muslim communities, is also one of the people who took them into an illegal war in Iraq. And so symbolism is important here, right? I mean, we need to keep this. So we have an officer who's going to be appointed soon here in Canada to lead Ottawa's Office of De-Radicalization. And symbolism is powerful, right? It's really powerful. We wouldn't put the person who has for 15 years antagonized the community in his support of a war that many people felt was an illegal war. So I mean, I think that's just starting with the symbolism, right? I mean, that's not even scratching the surface of the reality that it was not really a preventative strategy. It was an informant strategy. It was about take money and inform on those in your community, and it was paying for informants. It wasn't paying for programs to really prevent. I mean, there are a few that are, I mean, don't get me wrong, there are a few. I've seen a few that have actually been quite interesting. But what's problematic is that they become sullied by the name of being a part of Prevent. And they're no longer seen as a partner in CVE. They're seen as complicit with the greater, stronger apparatus of that system. And so, you know, it's really delicate. And this is where, again, you know, policy making and on CVE is that fine tuning. Anybody who you know, plays an instrument knows that these things really need fine tuning. It's that kind of care and balance that's required. It also requires people who understand the community, right? I mean, just like I mentioned about youth, you wouldn't put, you know, a 70-year-old in charge of creating a youth program. We have to have young people from the communities themselves to be a part of this. And I think once we start seeing, you know, I think the wrong names in charge of these programs, we need to be cautious, and then everything sort of, unfortunately, goes awry from there. But I hope that answered some of your question. Thank you. So I think should we just take one last question? Do we have more than? I'm just conscious that there's a film, and I'll take that one after, but I'm just conscious that there may be a film that needs to be seen.
Hello,
Hi.
I'm Amy, also
Hi, Amy.
one of the students here.
Fantastic.
So if we put this preventative strategy into place and we see this working, it kind of breaks down the recruitment strategies that ISIS has been using. Do you see the recruitment getting more aggressive? How do you see that playing out when we've kind of put a block on how they've typically recruited people? How do you see their new strategy happening?
Yeah, and in fact, we have seen ISIS become more active in actually trying to motivate people to stay where you are and create lone wolf attacks. So this has really become quite important. In fact, what's really interesting, it's made it very easy for them in the sense that, you know, just before your atrocity, that's when you should come out and say that you're a member of ISIS. And so we've had these situations where many have seen in this news, for example, people say there was no clue, there was no, you know, any signal. And then, of course, at the very last minute, they lay claim. And that's partly because ISIS has also made it easier for them to have a pledging of allegiance, too. And it could be as easy as a Facebook post, right? I do think that it does get harder and harder. As we get more soft targets, as we get more lone wolves, more ISIS-inspired and less ISIS-directed, the challenge is going to be more immense. And I think that's where, again, you actually need even more CVE. And again, we just need to do the math in terms of we don't have the capabilities to do it. So you need to empower the community to be your partner to help mitigate this. And I think that's really what we ultimately need to do. Thank you. Great, I'm just gonna take that, should I take that question? I guess not, sorry. Whoever sent that question online, it disappeared off my screen, so I couldn't even take it if I tried. Oh, there it is. Okay. You have mentioned that ISIS recruits. I watch podcasts and online webcasts, so I'm a bit biased here. You have mentioned that ISIS recruits are those who are most vulnerable and on the margins. The most recent attack that ISIS has claimed responsibility for in Dhaka, Bangladesh, was perpetrated by young men from educated elite backgrounds. One of them was also a Canadian. How do you explain or account for these factors? Wow, she asked a good question. Well, it goes back to the reality that we don't have a perfect profile. And what I've given you in terms of a laundry list is evolving and changing all the time. It's not so much that they're uneducated or educated. In fact, it's more about that social psychology feeling of not connecting, not feeling like they're a part of a community. that they may come from homes and communities that does not accept them. They're searching for identity. They're searching for a place to belong. And again, that is a problem that is a generic one for youth across the demographic, across religious lines, across ethnic lines and community lines. And that's why we need to see it as such, that there is alluring, that we need to stop this, but the best way to stop it is through community support. Thank you. I'll stand here.
Bessma, being a CIGI Senior Fellow, I've had the very, very good fortune of hearing her speak numerous times on a number of different topics, and she always leaves me wanting to hear much more and continue the dialogue, so thank you.
Follow me on Twitter. @B_Momani.
So thank you very much, Bessma, for your insights tonight about the genesis of ISIS, Iraq and Syria, and helping us to understand this terrorist group and the new ISIS-inspired individuals. From the challenges of fighting this group to the current loss of ISIS territory, you examined for us how foreign fighters are now an intelligence and policing matter for Western governments. I think this audience would agree that promoting community resilience in Western societies is not just more economical and feasible in tackling homegrown terrorism, but also that preventing violent extremism is the best offense against future homegrown threats to Western countries. So thank you very much, and globally, I should say. I'd like to call Tom to the stage.
Well, Dr. Momani, thank you for an excellent and interactive presentation that clearly appealed to the wide range of people in our audience today. Thanks very much again for your time.